Throughout Fortnite Chapter 5 Season 2, the entire competitive community thought the Wings of Icarus were awful. Almost all of the useful strategies required you to combine it with the Flowberry Fizz as you take fall damage otherwise, plus they have a massive hitbox, and most importantly, it's just incredibly difficult to find a set of wings for both players on a team. Sure, there were some useful rotations you could make with them, but it was just so difficult for teams to build a game plan around an item they get so inconsistently and has such a high risk. But one man's trash is another man's treasure, as when the FNCS Grand Finals rolled around, a handful of some of the best teams in the world were all carrying the Wings of Icarus in the first game. They clearly knew something that we didn't. The item had received a buff, and somehow almost nobody knew about it. 4 days before the FNCS Grand Finals, where $1 million in prize pool was up for grabs, Epic Games released a patch. Now, in the version 29.30 patch notes, they mentioned a bunch of boring stuff that I don't care about LEGO, but made no mention of the changes to the Wings of Icarus that they had just made. In fact, none of the leakers had even flagged this change either. It was a stealth buff that only some of the best players in the world had figured out. You see, by using the Wings of Icarus against a structure, the animation will cancel and you'll be able to pull out your weapon. Almost everyone thought that this would cause the player to take fall damage, as this was how it was designed and this is how it's been for the entire season. But I had my guys over at Assyrian GG look into exactly what changed in the version 29.30 patch, and Epic Games added 3 new variables. The most important was the grant till fall damage immunity. Basically, if you cancel the wing animation and by bumping into a structure, the player will no longer take any fall damage. Now, this sounds like a pretty minor change, but this was actually crucial to make them viable. Before this, almost every single strategy required the Wings of Icarus to be combined with the Flowberry Fizz, but now the item could be used throughout the entire game. And of course, one of the teams that had noticed this change was Swizzy and Vannak. They were watching Zagu's stream from the Asia region when they realized that the Wings of Icarus did not create any fall damage and that they had been buffed. So then 2 days before the FNCS Grand Finals, they decided to completely change their entire strategy to carry these, which of course was a very good decision given they won the tournament. Since they landed at Brawler's Battleground, which is deep into the corner of the map, on far zones they were able to stay on high layers and continually ramp over their heads, and by hitting their heads off of this, they were able to cancel the animation and propel themselves forwards without taking any fall damage because of the patch. A rotation strategy that almost everyone else in the lobby hadn't realized. But it wasn't until the end of the game where the Wings' versatility was truly shown. During the 10th zone, Swizzy and Vannak both tank the storm using bananas and pop a Flowberry Fizz. From here, they're the furthest team deep into the storm, so using the low gravity Flowberry effect, they both use their wings whilst touching a wall, which again cancels the animation and sends them both flying up into the sky with the low gravity effect. Chapatini on height had absolutely no idea Swizzy and Vannak were both now way above them, because nobody thought any teams were going to use the wings in this lobby, so almost no height teams were conditioned to look above them, which gave Swizzy and Vannak the element of surprise and allowed them to easily take height. Ironically, they lost height because Sky and Scroll used bananas to retake height with the coin dashes, but Swizzy and Vannak just simply dropped down from height, switching to the wings, as this actually cancels any fall damage. And then they died. But of course, it's not just vertically that Swizzy and Vannak used the wings. In game 2, they had a completely max distance 7th zone rotation, and using the Wings of Icarus, they managed to use only 11 builds during this entire rotate, whereas the majority of the other teams surrounding them used over 50. The most important part of this rotation is their starting position and timing, which is slightly in from the edge of zone. Since the previous zone pulled towards this direction, this causes a large amount of congestion around the edge of the storm. So by positioning themselves slightly away from the edge on top of this hill, they not only are able to get an elim by looking back into the storm, but also put themselves in a spot where there's nobody else in front of them to shoot them when they rotate. So this allows them to rotate early by Flowberry Fizzing and editing a cone diagonally to wing cancel off of. They then continue to do this 2 more times, harvesting some wood as they rotate before they get into exactly the same position in the 7th zone, slightly away from the edge and up some elevation. In total, they only lost 11 builds on rotation here, expending another 15 to create 3 metal boxes in the 7th zone. Coming into endgame, they notice Cringe and Noms are on height in wood and spray them out from the backside of the storm in an attempt to take height. This drops the team down to only a few layers above them, which then allows Swizzy and Vannak to again double wall boost with the wings at the same time to claim height. Notice though, this time they did this without the Flowberry Fizz. Now, this retake would not have been possible before the version 29.30 update, as without the Flowberry Fizz, they would just run the risk of dying to fall damage if they weren't able to connect to the builds up above. From this height position, they're easily able to clean up the rest of the lobby and win game number 2. But interestingly enough, the wings are even better if you're left as a solo. Out of the 12 games of the CS Grand Finals. 4 of these games came down to Swizzy or Vannak making incredible solo clutches. In fact, they actually gained 259 out of their 880 points that they got across the whole tournament just by solo clutching. When Vannak goes down in game number 3, Swizzy is able to distance himself away from the aggressive team by diagonally boost cancelling with the wings. Since he's now safe in zone ahead of the other team, he can now turn around and look back and use this to his advantage because Asa and Marco's late rotation has started to get them lobby focused. This confident 1v2 pushing onto another team that Swizzy does repeatedly throughout this entire endgame is what not only gives him a refresh on his materials here, but continually keeps him above the Storm Surge threshold as a solo. Throughout this endgame, he repeatedly uses the wings to put himself in some of the best positions total, clutching up 42 points by himself by getting a 9th place finish. But one of the really interesting things about this game actually is not how Swizzy and Vannak played, but instead how it was won by Swizzy and Podesai, another team who were using the wings. They take height in the final moving zones, and at the same time both use the right-click attack option that the wings have to smash down onto the players down below on low ground. Snazzy breaks the box down below, but unfortunately is wiped out. However, Podesai crashes onto his head and is able to win the game from there. Now, remembering one of the reasons that the majority of players don't carry the wings is because they are just very difficult to find. However, this is not a problem for Swizzy and Vannak. Their drop spot of Brawler's Battleground has 4 of the God chests, and these have a roughly 50% chance of dropping the wings of Icarus, and the other 50% chance is pretty much the Thunderbolt of Zeus. So a lot of teams on the map will be struggling to find these, whereas they have an almost guaranteed shot at having one each. Of course, here they're also able to get the Mythic Warforged AR, which is how they get the majority of their elims. Impressively, Swizzy was second on damage across the entire weekend without carrying a DMR, which just shows how much he shredded with his weapon. If you've watched my short, you'll know that they actually do leave the aspect of combat medallion. You may think, why do they leave these behind? Well, it only grants roughly a 5% boost in damage to all weapons, which for the trade-off of having your position known at all times, particularly when you're in Storm, is absolutely not worth it. Given the drop spots at the corner of the map, many teams could just wait for you at the edge of the Storm to rotate and continually hold you for tags over and over and over again, which could completely scuff your rotates. So they end up just leaving it behind, and clearly it didn't impact their damage whatsoever since they were first and second on the leaderboards. In the end game here, they get a refresh onto Noms and wing to the front side of zone, again without the Flowberry Fizz, which, as I'll say again, would not be possible prior to this patch. Then from the front side, Swizzy looks up and shreds Seti on height using the assault rifle, which gives them an opportunity just to build up and take it. As they start to run low on materials, Swizzy drops down to try and frag out. However, he doesn't want to waste any mats to go back up to Vannak's lair when he needs to bring him some builds, so he simply places a wall in front of him and uses the wing cancel to fire himself up back onto high ground whilst wasting minimal materials. From here, they do an incredibly smart variation of the wing slam that we saw in the previous game, where Vannak slams down into the front side of the zone, which pushes the 2 other players back into the Storm, which allows Swizzy with the banana pop to drop down at the front side and just spray out to get both elims, winning the game. Now, this looks incredibly smart, but from a tweet that I have seen, this was not intentional. Everyone will think I'm a genius, but I'm just an idiot. So yeah, it doesn't sound like they meant to do this, but if this is the kind of plays they make accidentally, I think that just speaks to how good these 2 are individually. With 2 games won, they are now first in the leaderboard, and game 5 is going absolutely swimmingly. They're set up perfectly until Swizzy gets kicked. There's pretty much been a bug for the entire season where players can just randomly get disconnected from the game, and it happened to multiple of the best players in the region, including Swizzy, who is in first place. So yeah, this game does not go very well. And in game 6, Swizzy actually ends up getting knocked in first moving zone to Reason, leaving Vannak as a solo. He plays really good by himself, however tries to do the wing exploit, but someone sprays out the ramp above him, which makes him fly straight up into the sky. And remember, as you're flying with these wings, your hitbox is massive, so Chicho is easily able to wipe him out of the sky. Despite having 2 complete duds of the final 2 games, they're still in first by 70 points going into the second day. However, in day 2, Forzen and Gudenbra would switch their drop spots to land and contest Swizzy and Vannak. Now, this wasn't just a grief, this is actually where they've been landing in for the majority of the season. However, they got absolutely wiped off spawn by Vannak's sick movement. Notice how once he gets the first knock onto this player, his instinct is not to finish the body or just to capitalize on the other player on the right hand peak. He actually drops off the back of this building and down inside to the lower ground, as the opponent more than likely would have been able to kill him here, but as you can see, when he runs out, Vannak is nowhere to be seen. This then allows Swizzy to come and spray from the other side, and Vannak can sneak back up, and they create a perfect pinch, easily wiping out the duo. Now, Swizzy goes down later on rotation to Reason, however Vannak's insane movement continues all the way through this endgame. This is a 69-point nice solo clutch that he ends up doing all the way to a top 4, simply just by sneaking behind old builds, sprinting and mantling when he sees other players on his lair, and hiding in little corners. You might not think it's a highlight reel because he is literally just running about, but the fact he managed to survive to a top 4 really shows how good his fundamentals are. Now, up until this point in the tournament, all 7 of the zones were absolutely nowhere near their drop spot in the southeast. However, Game 8 would be the first time they would finally pull a favorable zone. And Swizzy dies jumping in a box in endgame, and Vannak just runs at Matt, so he fizz wings up onto height and gets absolutely kovaxed by Cammy. Thankfully, in Game 9, they were gifted with yet another favorable zone, and they chose to position on this hill. Now, this is incredibly smart because there's only 2 positions where Loot Island can spawn from here, so by positioning themselves here and basing extremely high into the sky, both players can capitalize on the huge amount of players that are both rotating into the area to the northwest of them, and the amount of players that are trying to reharvest their materials on Loot Island and use the rifts to rotate. Because of this incredibly smart positioning and the fact they were sitting in a bush with double waterbending, they were over 1,000 above the storm surge threshold here. As soon as that next zone pulls far away from them, they simply fizz and wing over their heads because everyone else is still on the edge, and as we saw with our earlier rotations, no one is in front of them. Unfortunately though, whilst playing dead side here, Vannak dies to Chap and Teeny who are hiding around a corner, and Swizzy just wing strats away, luckily still with capped materials, setting himself up for yet another solo clutch. He sees a bunch of medkits and heals in the backside of the storm and makes a really smart play to pop his bananas to recharge his white HP whilst jumping into the backside of the storm. With a single use of the Flowberry Fizz and a ramp setup, he then wing rotates whilst medkitting in the backside of the storm to get him back into the safe circle. This is an incredibly smart play to survive a little bit longer and save a bunch of materials as a solo. From here, the majority of rotations are small EJ dashes using the wings in endgame to put himself onto good layers again, and this manages to clutch him all the way up to a 5th place, gaining 90 points as a solo. There were multiple situations in this particular game where Swizzy would have died as a solo had he not been carrying the wings. But unfortunately, the wings would actually be their downfall in game number 10. They're yet again contested off spawn, and Vannak plays like an absolute goat and 1v2s the team contesting them. However, unfortunately, another team hears this fight and rotates into third party. Whilst Vannak is trying to escape with a ramp over his head, as he's been doing for the majority of the other fights, Voltiax sprays out the ramp, which causes Vannak to fly straight up into the sky for the 2nd time this tournament, basically just making him a free elim. To make sure this didn't happen going into game number 11, Swizzy landed at this building here, which cut off a massive percentage of the loot from the contesting team, allowing them to guarantee the loot advantage. Because of this, Gudenbrat and Forzen actually ended up disengaging before they got a chance to fight, which minimally impacted Swizzy and Vannak's gameplay. For the 3rd time in the day, they were blessed with another zone in their drop spot, and they had the exact same surge strategy as they did in game 9 with their crazy surge base, taking advantage of the teams on Loot Island. However, when they rotated from it, they actually did have teams in front of them, which was Trulex and Chicho. Now, Trulex and Chicho could continually hold them on rotation if they stayed behind them, so they fizz dashed over their head, and as they were flying, they used the waterbending to pressure the team to ensure they couldn't spray them back. This bunny hopping over their head meant that they were now in front of them in terms of rotations, which meant that they could look back and hold any teams they wanted rather than being the teams that were held. They would continue this bunny hopping a couple times throughout the game. However, I thought I'd mentioned before this, Seti actually ends up getting teeny stratted midway through the end game, and I just thought this was hilarious, so I had to put this in here. But back to bunny hopping. Before the moving zones, they do this 3 times. The first one is when they're slightly outside of the 7th zone. From here, they bunny hop safely into the circle, somewhere around a quarter of the way in. However, when they see the 8th zone also pulls max distance, they can do the exact same thing again to get almost all of the way into that storm circle. As with the majority of other rotations we've talked about earlier, the timing of this is so important because they go early, which allows them to look back and hold tons of players for more damage and elims. But what's even better about this is since they waited here for so long, they can then bunny hop for a 3rd time over the entire lobby, setting themselves up entirely in the dead side of the zone. This again means all they need to do is look backwards at the entire lobby and they can spray at whoever they want. Then you can guess what they do first moving zone. Yes, you guessed it. They fizz, bunny hop over the whole lobby to front side, look back, repeat. They continue to repeat this up until the 10th zone, where the same as every single other time they've looked to take height, they start scouting up above, knowing they have more materials. However, at this time, Teeny, who's on height, accidentally falls off from height trying to use the wings to drop down and hilariously ends up landing behind someone and one pump them, which is great. But for Swizzy and Vannak, this means that height is now free and they can just take it from here and try and hold it. From here, Swizzy gets a ton of elims at the backside of the storm and drops down using the winds to cancel the fall damage to pick up the loot so that they can guarantee the win. But unfortunately, he gets full pieced in the backside of the storm, holding all of these materials. With some quick thinking from Vannak, he uses his last banana to jump down into the backside of the storm to grab all of the extra materials that Swizzy just picked up from all of the refreshes and is able to get back up onto height. He continues to play out the entire endgame until it comes down to a 1v1 between him and Teeny. He makes a phenomenal play to drop down using the Flowberry Fizz effect to cancel his fall damage and is beautifully able to grab the wall in front of him, dealing a little bit of damage. However, Teeny is able to escape with the materials that he has, whereas Vannak has absolutely zero. But in this moment, he makes an insanely aggressive and smart play to harvest 3 brick from the brick down below, place a wall in front, and fire himself up onto height using the wing cancel, allowing him to win the 1v1 against Teeny. I'm going to be real, the fact that under the pressure of winning FNCS, this man had the composure to make a play like this shows how different Vannak is. At this point, the tournament was already won, but in the last game, they still managed to get a 6th place finish, securing not only their FNCS win, but their ticket to the Global Championships at the end of the year. Over on NA, of course, we saw Peterbot and Poyo have the most dominant season in Fortnite history, and if you want to see all of their strategies, you can click on this video right now.